So I want to kick us off. Welcome everyone for coming. So this is our panel on the way forward on managing cybersecurity risk or managing cyber risk management. And I want to thank the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security, which is of GW, which is sponsoring the event. And a special thank you also to the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, which is the grant maker behind this event and generously funded the research. The topic we're here to discuss today centers around the NIST Cybersecurity Framework for protecting critical infrastructure cybersecurity. And part of the reason I think that we want to spend some time talking about that today is because it has become really the primary foundational tool in the area of cyber risk management. And I think it's time, as we approach 5 years from the issuance of the first framework, the first final version of the framework in February of 2013, or February of 2014, to do a review and look at where we are and look back a little bit at what the implementation has meant. So I'm going to take a moment to briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll jump right in with some of the experiences that they've had working in both the policy areas for implementation of the cybersecurity framework, as well as talking about the implementation, the concrete implementation experience of using the cybersecurity framework to adapt, update, and implement a new or an improved cybersecurity program within an organization. So starting on my left, Amy Mann is International Policy Specialist in the Applied Cybersecurity Division at NIST. She spent several years working at DHS on critical infrastructure cybersecurity, most recently in the DHS Office of Cyber Infrastructure and Resilience Policy. Directly to my left, Ari Schwartz is the Managing Director of Cybersecurity Services at Venable, the law firm. And before that, he served in a number of positions in the Obama administration, culminating in being the Special Assistant to the President in the Cyber Directorate at the National Security Council, and spent several years before that working on cybersecurity policy and technology policy issues, both at NIST and with the Secretary's Office at the Commerce Department. To my right, Chris Boyer is the Assistant Vice President for Public Policy at AT&T and was a co-chair of the FCC CISRIC, or Cybersecurity Risk. I'm going to blow it.
Communication Security, Reliability, and Interoperability.
Thank you. Working group for group that talked about how to implement the cybersecurity framework and provided recommendations into how to implement the cybersecurity framework into telecommunication companies' risk management approach to cybersecurity. There are a number of other titles for Chris. I'll mention that he's currently the chair of the Information Security and Privacy Advisory Board at NIST, a former chair of the Telecoms Sector Coordinating Council, and also the rep to the NSTAC, which is the National Security Telecom Advisory Council, from AT&T to that organization. So it has a lot of good stuff to tell us about implementing cybersecurity frameworks. And finally, on the right, Pete Lorenzo is a member of the firm, the Chief of Staff, and the Chief Information Security Officer at Shepard Kaplan, an investment advisory firm in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm going to go through very quickly just an overview of the cybersecurity framework itself, and then hand it off to Chris to take over and talk a little bit about the implementation at AT&T and some of his experience with the development of the framework and the ancillary work that he's done around cybersecurity risk management policy. NIST was instructed in Executive Order 13636 in February of 2013 to develop a framework to actually convene the private sector. They did so in a series of workshops, 5 workshops over the course of 2013, to, within 1 year, to issue a cybersecurity framework, a framework for how we would protect, how critical infrastructure could adopt a new approach, a better approach to protecting their cybersecurity and improving their cybersecurity programs. Obviously, the 5 items that the executive order required of NIST were to identify the security standards and guidelines applicable across critical infrastructure sectors, to provide a prioritized, flexible, repeatable, performance-based, and cost-effective approach to doing that, helping critical infrastructure identify, assess, and manage their risk, providing guidance that's technology neutral, right? One of the things we note about the cybersecurity framework is it's not a standard, it's not something you can perform to, but it provides the basic framework for people to figure out what standard or what approach to adopt. And finally, indicate how to measure the performance of the framework by users. After the 5 workshops, issuing a draft, accepting comments through an RFI and RFC, and responding to those comments, NIST in February of 2014 issued the version 1. We now call version 1.0 of the cybersecurity framework. Since then, there have been additional workshops and the release of both in draft and then in final version earlier this year, the release of the 1.1 version of the framework. I'm going to let Amy talk about sort of the way forward and some of the more recent developments around framework itself. But I did want to mention that this year has seen a lot of additional milestones sort of around the cybersecurity framework, developments related to cyber risk management becoming more baked into the system, if you will. So we have, earlier this year, the Security and Exchange Commission issuing interpretive guidance on cybersecurity notifications by public companies, and encouraging those companies to develop a way of measuring and managing their risk that will allow them to make informed notifications, not just of incidents that occur, but actually of risk that is inherent in their organization. This is partnered, of course, with the New York Department of Financial Services, which for its regulated entities now requires essentially CSF implementation by those companies. The employment of a CISO with relevant background and capability, the development of a plan, and a certification that they are performing on that plan, that they are adopting, and those plans are supposed to be conformant with the cybersecurity framework and eventually with ISO 27001. GDPR took effect in May. Obviously that has to do with privacy, but privacy and cybersecurity are the twins in this space. So you have the implementation of compliance plans for GDPR are going to have a strong cybersecurity flavor to them. And then we saw the first SEC enforcement action on a cybersecurity issue recently, actually against an investment advisory firm in Iowa in September last month. So the pace of how the cybersecurity framework is as a foundational document being implemented into other places. I would be remiss not to mention Executive Order 13800, which of course required the federal agencies to implement a cybersecurity framework-based plan and develop a target profile based on the cybersecurity framework, and in a sense made mandatory something that otherwise is voluntary. So we see the rapid adoption of cybersecurity framework in a variety of different contexts. We see an increase in the amount of expectation and hope for the framework as a way of controlling the ever-expanding sort of attack surface in the cybersecurity environment. So that just is to set sort of a baseline and a little history. I'm going to stop talking now and hand it off to Chris and let him talk a little bit about his experience with the framework as well as the other policy issues and the experience in AT&T of implementing it. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about a few things. One is kind of the overall kind of process for developing the framework, and then I want to talk about what the communications industry has done with the framework, and a little bit about AT&T, how we're using the framework, and then I'll talk about kind of what in my opinion, kind of what's next. So starting with the process, I think as Adam mentioned, there's been, the process itself of developing the framework is a very collaborative process. NIST conducted, I think, somewhere around 5 different workshops throughout 2015 to pull together the framework. Industry was heavily involved in those. I personally attended all the workshops. Several of my colleagues did. Other sectors, whether it was finance or electric or other critical infrastructure sectors, Maybe that's better. So the other sectors were all pretty heavily engaged as well. And so the process, I think, was one, as far as what I'll call multi-stakeholder processes in Washington, I thought it was very effective, and it's in the document, and I think it's evidenced in the document itself. The document is, it's a risk-based framework. It's very flexible, so it can apply to any industry segment, whether it's comms or IT or finance. It's also flexible enough that a small business could use the framework as well as a large entity like mine. So I think a lot of the collaboration that was built into it is reflected in the final document. In terms of what the industry's done with it since it was been developed, in the communications sector, we have an entity, I think we just mentioned a second ago, the CSRIC, it's CSRIC. It stands for Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council. It's been around since 2009. It's a predecessor organization to what used to be called the NRIC, the Network Reliability and Interoperability Council. And what those groups have been doing is putting together best practices and standards for the communications industry for a number of years. The first set of security standards that were developed were back in 2002, 2003. And it's all commissioned underneath the FCC. So once the framework was released, the CSRIC put together a working group. Consisted of over 100 people from the industry. We had a lot of carriers and my brethren from the industry side. We also had a lot of our suppliers and vendors and a lot of other entities that were engaged from the government side. And we basically took the framework and we put together a series of framework profiles for the different segments of the communications industry. When I say communications industry, it's not just entities like AT&T. The way the government divides up communications is there's 5 segments. There's wireline, wireless, cable, satellite, and broadcast. So we developed a profile for each one of those 5 segments, basically looking at the framework and taking I think there's about 98, what do you want to call them, 98 functions inside the framework, and we basically took those and put together a list that said, out of those, what are the top 10 or 15 or top 20 for each one of those critical segments of communications, and develop profiles for each of those. That work was completed in 2015 and approved by the CSRIC Council. So there's been a lot of activity on the communications side and kind of promote. And then once the profiles were developed, then we put together an effort to kind of promote the use of those profiles throughout the industry. So that's kind of what the sector writ large has been doing. And I know several of the companies that I work with are actively using the framework. And then for AT&T specifically, so we obviously had a security program that predated 2013 when the framework was announced. The company, there are different aspects of AT&T that are ISO 27001 certified. We have an internal security policy program that we basically map to international standards such as ISO 27001, COBIT, PCI DSS, and other security standards. And so what the framework did for us is we were able to take the framework and use it as a validation tool against our existing programs. So we went through an intensive effort internally where our security policy team and our chief security office took the framework, evaluated our existing program, and we basically benchmarked that program against a variety of these standards, including the framework. So the framework for us was more of a reference guide for assuring that our existing policies were inclusive, that they covered all the main aspects of the framework. And what we were able to find from that process is that we basically are already pretty much performing almost all the functions that are listed in the framework today in some capacity or another, through our existing program. But it performs a validation tool for an entity such as ours. I think you probably would hear something similar from any other large enterprise that's been heavily involved in these areas for a number of years. The other thing that we've been able to do at the framework is we have a security consulting arm within AT&T that deals a lot with our small and mid-sized business customers, trying to promote better security services for them. So they've been able to use the framework as a way to talk through kind of how different, this is a business opportunity for us, but it's also helping to promote the framework and meeting with some of our clients around different ways different solutions and tool sets they can use to implement the framework. And the last thing I'll talk about is kind of what I think is next. One of the big things I think that we're struggling with as an industry is what to do about the Internet of Things security. I've said this on numerous panels in the past, so I'll say it again, is that I do feel like there's a need for a concerted effort in the US to raise the bar for IoT security. So I won't call it an IoT framework. It could be an IoT profile. It could be a number of different things, but we need to do a framework-like process to raise the bar on IoT. I know that NIST is doing a lot of work in IoT. There's a lot of activity happening there. I'm increasingly concerned that we're going to see a GDPR-like situation evolve because the European cybersecurity law that's being proposed would empower NISA to go develop a set of standards for IoT devices security, which I think is all well and good. But the problem we're going to have is we need harmonization of whatever those standards are internationally. You're not going to see people building products that are solely used in the EU or solely sold in the US. It's not very likely that will happen. So the more we can drive harmonization, and the best way to do that is for the US to show leadership on that issue. And I think developing some sort of framework or framework-like tool that we can promote internationally would be extremely helpful to advancing our interests internationally. So with that.
Pete, do you want to?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm going to come at everything from a little bit different of an approach. So my name is Pete DiLorenzo. I work over at Shepherd Kaplan. I work for a $7 billion registered investment advisory firm. So we deal with mostly private wealthy individuals, institutions, things like that. But we're a pure small business, so we're under 60 people. So for us, our story is much different than an AT&T. Obviously, you guys are much larger, had a program before, things like that. So for us, back in 2013, as an SEC-regulated firm, we sort of got stuck with the SEC coming out and saying, hey, look, we care about cybersecurity out of the blue. And we're sitting there going, what do? We don't know what to do. They sent out basically it was sort of 150 registered investment advisors got investigated by the SEC, but it was more of we're going to come in, we're going to see what you guys have, and we're going to try to baseline sort of the future. So we freaked out, straight up. We were like, oh my God, how are we going to deal with this? Because I'm, again, Boston-based firm. So in 2010, there were privacy laws that came into effect in Massachusetts, but it was much more geared towards the PCI world, not necessarily a wealth management firm. So we started to go out there and look around and say, how are we actually going to deal with this? An average 50 to 60 person company that's out there doesn't have this massive budget. Most don't have a exotic tech team with a chief information security officer. A lot of them have consultants and things like that. So that's when I started to really go out and research what's out there and what's free, because we can't go out and spend all this money. We can't go out and try to figure out how to, work with COBIT and some of these other these frameworks that are out there. So we ended up sort of stumbling upon NIST, and I fell in love with it right away. But my issue was the first document I got was a 150-page document that looked like a Bible, and I'm like, this isn't sellable to a small business. I can't go into my firm with this stack of papers and say, hey, look, this is what we want to do, and the reason for doing this is because some person or some group of people said this is important. So I had to really think about, how do I sell this internally to the firm? And at that time, we did have a risk committee. I was on the executive team, so it's a little bit easier for me to be able to do this, but I still didn't have enough from NIST, so I actually went back into the industry. I even emailed, there was an email address, like an info address for NIST, and I literally emailed and said, hey, you guys got to do better. What you've offered here is good, but you can't penetrate the small business. It's not going to happen. So I started to work with them, and I actually found that SANS, which is now CIS, had a control framework out there that was called the SANS Top 20 Critical Security Controls. And I grabbed that and said, okay, if I follow the top 20 of these and I go through these, we should be, quote unquote, pretty good. But then I took that framework and realized that it overlays so well with the NIST framework. And that's where I sort of jump-started it internally and said, look, we are going to go through the SANS top 20. We're going to get comfortable with these. We're going to create a budget for these. And we literally took it and threw it into an Excel document and graded ourselves. We went through and said, we're really good here. We're deficient there. We need to do better here. And we were able to overlay NIST on top of that, and it gave us the risk management piece that you don't get from the SANS top 20. It made it a lot easier for us to go through this. And again, when you have a risk committee, you have an executive team, it was easy for me to go there and say, hey, look, we're really good at inventorying our equipment. We really understand the software that we have, but we're not that great with our incident response. And with being an investment advisory firm, and we're dealing with billions of dollars, it's important to have that program really built in basically something that everybody in my firm can latch onto. The whole goal for us was, I didn't want myself to be the champion for the program. I wanted the whole firm to invest in this and understand, hey, look, we care about this. And it's amazing because now I look back over the 4 years, and one interesting thing that's happened to us is we've been able to turn what we've done with the NIST framework not only to protect our firm, but it's now become a sales pitch. So now when we go out to meet a private client, let's say a $10 million wealthy individual, the conversation goes from, we're going to protect your investments, we're going to protect your money, but now we're also going to protect your identity. So what's actually done is it's given us another sort of pillar of our business where we're not just selling what investments that we have or how we think the markets are going to do, but when the Equifax breach happened about a year ago, all our clients, they didn't freak out. They knew that we were looking at what they had. We knew that they knew we had the NIST framework behind us. They knew that we were paying attention to them. And now we've even moved even further in the past year where we've actually have a lot of institutions where we will come on site. We'll do these sort of talks where we discuss with them how is their cybersecurity framework going. And we're talking small to large companies, because you'd be amazed. I mean, AT&T is a huge company, but there are some large companies out there that don't have the expertise, or they don't have the backing on the executive team level where people actually care about cybersecurity. So what we've really done is we have literally made this a core piece of our business where, yes, we're selling wealth management, yes, we're selling our funds and things like that, but now we're sort of looking at this from the perspective of we have all this experience, these 4 or 5 years embedded with NIST, and now we're really trying to push it down to our clients and our institutional clients and saying, care about cybersecurity. Don't be the next Equifax. Don't be the next Target. Don't, look at this as have everybody invest in this. And this has really helped us be able to do that. But I will say, as we're starting to move forward, the big issue NIST is going to run into, and I think the whole industry is going to run into, is the small business is way more important than people think. There's more small businesses out there than the AT&Ts of the world. So it's really hard to get down to that 50 and under and penetrate that market. So I think one of the things I wanted to do is really help push this to even my competitors that are out there and have them understand this is an important thing. And just to dovetail off something you said with GDPR, I'm sure you've all seen what California's doing in 2020. I'm telling you right now, that law, in my view, is going to end up hitting all the states that are out there. So I truly feel like in the next 3-4 years, the GDPR-like policies that are out there are going to hit the whole country. So the way we're looking at it for the next couple of years is we're hitting GDPR straight on. We're hitting California straight on. We're not worried about it. We're looking at it as everybody should probably have similar policies. So that's sort of how we're mandating, and that's how we're trying to lead sort of the wealth management side of things in the NIST framework. So that's sort of our view on it.
Great, that's terrific. I think we'll do questions afterwards, so I'm going to go straight to Art.
Yeah. So let me just take a step back and talk a little bit about some of the theory behind the NIST framework, and then how we implement it when we work with our clients. So the best description I've heard of the framework is actually from Ajay Banga, who's the CEO of MasterCard. He called it the Rosetta Stone for cybersecurity. And I think that what he means by that is that before we had this cybersecurity framework, we had a lot of different standards kind of in different areas that were mostly threat-based. You had some frameworks that were more industry-based, some maturity models that were industry-based, and they would use similar language to talk about different things. Because what happens is in cybersecurity still today, a new threat comes along, a solution is built to that threat, right? And then standards are built around kind of the category of that kind of threat. So you end up with these standards that are sort of bottom-up driven. They're driven by the threat. They're not driven by how someone coming in and looking at all of them would go about trying to address them and prioritize. So you end up with lots of different cybersecurity standards in different areas, and hundreds of them. And a chief information security officer has to decide which of them to do first if they're coming into a new area, and what tools to take on in order to address those. So the NIST, what the cybersecurity framework did was to take those and start to put them in categories. So actually, the way that I think of it, I break it the NIST, the cybersecurity framework up into two pieces. So you have the detect and you have the identify and protect side of it, right, which was kind of the protection part, and then you have detect, respond, recover functions, which are the respond and recover side. So there's kind of the try and stop from being attacked, and then what do you do once you have been attacked? Because everyone will have incidents. So And in breaking them it down that way, then you go to the 5 functions, and then you have the categories underneath them. In each of those, under each of those is literally hundreds or thousands of standards that kind of all flow together, and you can tie them together depending on the industry you're in. Now, what NIST has encouraged and what has started to happen is, as Chris said, is we started to see these profiles be built by industry, where different industries then can take it down another layer to that and say, well, here's how we prioritize it in our industry to help leadership in each of those areas to say, here's what we need to do first because we're in that industry. In fact, just this week, I mean, we're now 4.5 years into the release of the framework, but the financial sector has put out their profile, which is very detailed, very well done. It's been in draft for a while, but it's now been finalized, and I think that will make things easier for the folks that come after Pete now and are looking to implement and to utilize the framework to do different things in the financial sector, no matter if they're small or medium businesses. Now, one thing that we've tried to do in some of the work that I've been doing, I helped to lead a group called the Cybersecurity Coalition, which is the main cybersecurity and tech companies that work on cybersecurity, and AT&T is a member. We built these a threat-based profile. So rather than having just an industry-wide focus, looking at a different threat that would use a lot of different NIST controls. And the 2 threats that we focused on, which really came out of a concern out of botnets and the President Trump's Executive Order 13800 which calls for work on botnets. It says we focused on working on denial of service attacks as one area, and botnet mitigation as another area, because those are 2 things where botnets have impact and how to stop botnets. So we put out 2 different profiles. The denial of service one is done. We're releasing it next week at the NIST Risk Management Conference in Baltimore, and then we'll have the next draft of the botnet mitigation one as well. And NIST has said that they are interested in turning it into a special publication that then would be required of agencies, and others in industry could pick up from there. So we're very excited about that. And what that allows people to do is to say, so you have financial services, you see an increasing number of denial of service attacks against financial services. It's the financial services industry. Leadership's becoming concerned about those denial of service attacks. They can say to their staff, what are we doing to stop, to make sure that we're not going to be hit by a denial of service attack? They can take our profile, they can take the industry profile, financial services industry profile, marry the 2, right, and highlight and say, for our industry, we know that we're prioritizing these areas. And with I think one thing to keep in mind here is, risk management means that we're not talking about ever finishing, right, the work in this space. We're just constantly improving the work in this space. So what the framework is helping people to do is to say, here's where we are today, here's where we want to get to by the end of the year, within 6 months, within 3 months, et cetera, and set those kind of baselines and goals down the road based on how to prioritize within the sector. And so so in this space, they would say, if financial services and DDoS would take the 2, marry them up and say, here's an area where we need to do better. For let's say for denial of service, it's make sure that we have the backups and the capacity and the resilience to be able to respond. In this case, we think we're here today. We need to get to over here in order to be able to be fully responding to the level of attacks that we're seeing, and make sure that you're in the process to doing that, and report back to the board, to the risk management folks, on how you've been doing in getting from here to there. So let me just briefly talk about how we're implementing it with some of our clients as well. Coming from at a law firm, I'm not a lawyer. I do cybersecurity consulting from the law firm. We work closely with the clients in order to try and help them look for the problems, right? Because a lot of times we'll talk to general counsels who'll say, but if we find problems, we're not going to be able to fix them all. We don't have money to fix them all, et cetera. Our goal is to help them find the liability where liability is the greatest, and utilize risk management tools around that. The profiles and the framework help us to do that. They're a great tool in order to help us to do that. It's not the only one we use, obviously. If you're talking about a retail industry or a hospitality industry, we're going to use the FTC's starts with security controls that they've said are the priority as the main document. And then we will write a memo to the general counsel, and underneath that, we'll have an attachment that will be the NIST framework, and maybe it'll be the ISO standards as well that and kind of lay out the more technical pieces underneath that original memo that goes to the general counsel. But in both cases, whether you're talking to the security folks or the general counsel's office or the board of directors, you end up with the same set of priorities, right, based on the tools that are out there today. So that's utilizing the NIST framework helps to kind of tie it all together and bring us that kind of translation between what boards expect, what general counsels are looking for, and what security folks are looking for.
Thanks, sir. Amy, good.
Thank you. Just want to give a couple of updates of where we're standing now from a NIST perspective. Another milestone that we had this year was the release of version 1.1 back in April. So I'll go over a little bit of some of the updates we have from that, what we're seeing now in terms of implementation since the release of that, and what's next. So back in April, I mentioned we released version 1.1. We were able to gather some feedback from stakeholders, similar to the process for developing the framework in the first place. It's very important to us to hear what are the important topics out there. Cyber threat landscape keeps changing, so we want to be able to continue evolving and making the framework useful as a risk management approach. And so that always depends on the feedback we get from our stakeholders. So the version we released in April incorporates some of what we heard were some of the most important topics that are facing everyone and what they'd like to see in the framework. This includes supply chain risk management, authentication, authorization, identity proofing, and some language too on coordinated vulnerability disclosure. So our newest version incorporates some language on that in the core aspects of the profile. And there's also some updated guidance and clarification on how the framework can be useful as a tool. There's some updated language on how it can be used as a good way to communicate how you're complying with your various business objectives and requirements. It also helps explain a little bit how the framework can be applicable across a range of technologies, from IT to OT and cyber physical systems. So now that we've gone through that process and put out this updated version, we've now been focusing more on implementation and the ways that we've seen it being taken, used, and adapted both here and internationally. We've already heard about some of the good use cases that we've seen recently, the release of the financial services sector cybersecurity profile, which was a really good example of how the framework can be used for something to address a need like harmonization of all the many different regulations and approaches that that sector has to harmonize in order to meet their cybersecurity needs. So that was a very encouraging one to see how it was used. There was the reference of the 5 functions, but also adaptations and additions of additional functions of governance and dependency management. And also, as Ari mentioned, it's great to see different type of focus as a threat profile with the DDoS and botnet mitigation. So those are going to be really great examples of how someone can use that and help identify gaps in mitigating these types of threats and be a good tool for prioritizing the use of your own resources against a good target profile for mitigating these threats. We've also had more of a focus recently on international work, both having a cybersecurity priority in our Department of Commerce of trying to ensure that our cybersecurity policies and approaches are globally relevant. And we also have legislation, the Cybersecurity Enhancement Act of 2014, which gives us the mandate to keep updating the framework, but also gives us the go-ahead to continue dialogues with international industries and organizations. And that was also something we heard from our stakeholders as well, that internationalization of the framework was important. So to that end, we've been observing a lot of different use cases, both when version 1 first came out. There were a lot of early adopters. We saw Italy take it. Israel and Japan actually did direct translations and adapted it. So we saw some cases like with Italy, the incorporator based their national cybersecurity strategies off of it, but also expanded it in new and interesting ways. They had different approaches to risk management that went beyond what's in our framework. Israel has used it to put together their cyber defense methodology for mitigating risk to their organizations. Bermuda was another interesting case where NIST actually went down back in fall of 2017 to help explain different ways that they could incorporate into their government use. And they've leveraged that as well as other NIST documents like the risk management framework and the 853 controls, which has been great to see. We've also been hearing of other use cases. Earlier this year, Uruguay actually mentioned that they were on version 4 of their adaptation of the framework that's being used within government. And we're also continuing to see, not even just in strategies and documents, but references to the framework or the core, the 5 functions coming up in things like a minimum ICT standard that we saw Switzerland put out, and seen various countries in Europe as well using it, or the language of that within some of the requirements that they have for meeting the NIST directive. That's also been very encouraging to see. So in our approach, we want to continue having dialogues with these countries, offering any guidance as people are starting to use or adapt the framework. We actually went recently in September to Brazil. Our International Trade Administration and the Department of Commerce set up a good series of meetings with government and industry down there. It was a good opportunity to talk both from a government perspective and also with industry representatives down there on how we've been using and adapting the profile and the ways to use the framework. And also, as I mentioned, since Uruguay had adapted earlier that year, we were actually very fortunate to have a representative from their government come and talk about how they've been using it as well. It was always useful having a different voice besides our own talking about what they've been doing with the framework. So besides that, direct engagement with countries, since we are NIST, we also, of course, are engaging on the standards front and working with standards development organizations. The framework's not a US-only document and actually references many globally internationally accepted standards. So we're actually currently involved with some ISO IEC efforts. There's some work now to try to put some of the language from the framework into a technical specification that could become a standard. And also earlier this year, ISO IEC released a technical report, 27103, that is a set of guidelines that one can consider when developing a cybersecurity framework, and is a good way to leverage existing international standards when you're developing these types of frameworks. So there is language from the core, some of the subcategories from version 1 of the framework that you can find in this report, but it does not say that it is NIST or a US government developed document. So it sort of provides a nice neutral way if someone wants to reference or use some of the content you can find there, but not say that they're following in this document. They can reference an internationally accepted document. So we're very excited to see that as well. And so we'll continue working within these standards organizations. Other things that are coming up or where we're going from here is literally the next week we'll be going to Baltimore and having a NIST Cybersecurity Risk Management Conference. You may have remembered workshops in the past that have focused on the cybersecurity framework, but this year topics expanded a bit more, including some other topics like privacy engineering, supply chain risk management. So we're very excited about that. Great lineup of speakers, including some of my fellow panelists here today. And also on the international front, we're actually featuring a plenary session as well that'll have some representatives from other governments talking about their use of the framework and other NIST documents. So definitely encourage participation in that as a good way that we continue that dialogue with our stakeholders and hear what are people's thoughts on version 1.1 or what do they want to see. We'll typically continue updating the framework probably on about 3-year basis or so, but of course knowing that things can change or if there's a reason to ask sooner, we will, but we always welcome any feedback. We're also continuing to try to make the framework more globally accessible. We're trying to release very soon a Spanish translation of it, and we'll also continue to identify and post all the ones that we see out there. Our website has all those different translations that I mentioned earlier. And we also like to highlight positive use cases, different success stories. Most recently, we published one about the Japanese cross-sector forum using the framework as a means of communication between some of their member companies and subsidiary companies outside of the country. So we always like to show those as good examples and definitely continue to have those dialogues. I think I'll stop it there for now. Thank you.
I mean, thank you so much. I'm not going to stand up again. But I will take the moderator's prerogative to ask a question just to the whole panel as sort of a framing question, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. And that question is really, how do we ask it? Like, so I think we all agree that framework has been extremely important. You referenced the MasterCard CEO's description of it as a Rosetta Stone. I think, Pete, you talked about the fact that it's a lot of the top 20 controls that you were working with were consistent with framework and very much sort of embodied what you were trying to get out of framework. But without framework, you didn't have context. That it was just a list of controls on the one hand versus framework, which gave you a lot of sense of what you were trying to accomplish with that, so you could prioritize and manage your risk. But one thing about a voluntary framework is what is the measure of whether it is being successful. I think we recognize that the overall cyber ecosystem or environment is getting larger and more chaotic all the time. You know, there obviously continue to be larger and larger events that make the news, that take the headlines. But as you look at the background and backdrop as well, we talked a little bit about botnets and DDoS attacks. The fact that like the threats are continuing to evolve, and that our dependency on information technology or information communication technology infrastructure is always increasing. So, so how do we measure? Is it possible to measure globally whether the framework is successful? And do we have metrics for that? Do we have are there metrics for that coming, or do we not need metrics for that? Is the framework's role as a foundational baseline document sort of sufficient? So I will open that up and let anybody on the panel sort of weigh in on what they think about that.
So I'll start, please. Knowing that it is a bit difficult to quantitatively measure that, we have been very much relying on the good feedback that we've been hearing. We try to publish those success stories or those perspectives. We sometimes see numbers out there. You know, we've had past quotes about what % of industry might be using it here. We've seen even internationally, Japan had put out a statistic about 33% or so of some of their companies using or referencing the framework in some way. So as of now, we do definitely rely on what we hear others and what they say has been successful about it for them, since we see there's so many different ways to customize or use it. One number I will throw out that we recently published. So version 1 of the framework came out and was available for 4 years. And as I mentioned, 1.1 came out in April, so it's been out about 5 months now. So the first version of the framework over 4 years was downloaded about 262,000 times. And just now in 5 months, version 1.1 was downloaded 172,000 times. So already that's some indication that there's at least more interest or awareness of it. That's not necessarily, I know, a representation of how successful it's been, but at least it's an encouraging number to see that people are at least starting to consider use it and might see it then as a successful way to manage their risk.
I'll offer a couple thoughts. I mean, I think there's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there that the framework is being utilized. We heard some of that today, both in my comments, in your comments, and others. I do think that there is a challenge, though, in trying to measure the impact of the framework. I think you know, it's difficult to correlate the framework to the number of cyber incidents that we read about in the news, right? Because those can be happening for a lot of different reasons. And if you just do the math on it, you know, the number of devices that are out there that are connected to the internet is growing exponentially year by year. The number of attempts by other entities like nation states to hack into those devices is growing. So even if the framework was, you know, improving the cybersecurity posture, there's still a high probability that you're going to see more and more incidents, and they're going to continue to happen. So the fact that the point being that the fact that we're seeing incidents that are out there doesn't necessarily mean the framework is not working. But I do think that from an industry standpoint, there is value in trying to look into the extent to which the framework is being adopted. I've had conversations with Adam about this in the past, that there could be value, and I think there's reason to have value from the government's perspective in understanding the extent to which the framework is being used by industry. There should be a way to do that, I think, in a way that is not regulatory oriented or creates concern. That ought to be able to be done at a macro level, where you can look at it from an industry segment by segment standpoint without pinpointing or isolating individual companies, but evaluating the extent to which the framework is being used. And I would even take it a step further and say it's really not a question of is the NIST framework being used, but are company, you know, where do companies stand in terms of overall cybersecurity use of some of these standards? Because in this framework is just effectively an accumulation of other standards. I think going to your point about the SANs. So so some companies might say, look, I don't necessarily use the NIST framework per se. I also use ISO or I use SANs. And so, but the real question is, to what extent are companies implementing kind of basic security controls in their risk management program, whether it's NIST, whether it's ISO, whether it's SANS, whether it's COBIT, or what have you. That to me is a fair question to ask, and I think it would be worth evaluating to see, are policies driving companies in are the right incentive structures out there, and is the policy environment driving people towards adopting these types of solutions? That to me is a question that could be explored in more detail, so for what it's worth.
Yeah, just to add a piece to it too, I think, again, I'm always coming at everything from the small business side. I think from my perspective, the measurement doesn't necessarily matter as much. I always go back to an old Robert Mueller quote from years ago, which was basically, it's not if you're going to get hacked, it's sort of when you're going to get hacked. I mean, I think the big thing for me is sort of I don't necessarily care what framework you use, but I think you get to a point where if your firm or your company is not paying enough attention to the fact that you could be the next one on the news, or you could be the next one where the SEC is coming into your doors and saying, hey, we found a breach over here, and we're going to charge you X number of dollars, and which is going to cause all kinds of downstream effects for your firm. I mean, at the end of the day, when you're running like my firm's a $7 billion firm, if there's a news item out there that says, hey, Shepherd Kaplan got hacked yesterday and 100 clients are affected, and we charged them with the following regulation S/P violations, and it was $500,000 fine, we're never going to have another client. And you were talking a little bit about regulation. I'm a little bit different in the sense of I kind of like it forced down a little bit, because I found that being in the small business sector, unless CEOs believe that there's something like that, like a fine that can come down on them, they don't care. Because at the end of the day, when you're a small business, there's only one thing that matters, is what you're doing making money. And things like the NIST framework, they don't make money. You can argue and say, hey, look, hold on, but if you're secure, you can make money. And that's not the same way. They look at it as I have a product, the product makes me X. If I do a framework, the product's not making me any money. So you have to have someone in that office really being able to sell, well, you might be able to make money on the product, but if we don't have a company, we can't create that product and make the money. But it's sort of a little rabbit chase there, unfortunately, in the small business.
I don't think those challenges are just limited to small business. I mean, in all businesses, you have to make the business case for why you're investing in security. It might be a little easier for an entity like mine because the brand is such a big deal that the minute you're hit with an attack, there's a lot of concern about what damage that will do to the brand, or whether you're going to get fined, or regulatory actions. My main point on regulation is that in order to really accumulate data on the extent to which these programs are being adopted and used, companies have to feel comfortable sharing that information. And if they think it's going to be used as a regulatory hammer to come back and penalize them, then you're going to have a hard time getting data. So if you can do it in a way that's collaborative, and you're just gathering factual information to make sure you're on the right policy trajectory, I think that's a different question. And if I was on the other side of the table and I was representing the government, I would say, I'd like to know, are the programs that we're putting in place working? Are they doing anything? What are they actually having the effect they're intended to have? And the first question I would ask is it even being used? And how do I know that? And so outside of anecdotal evidence, there's probably ways to accumulate that data in a more collaborative way with industry that doesn't create a regulatory overhang. That's the challenge. And that's why, entities like what Adam was doing with GW and other places, like we like to work with academics, because they have the way of doing this in a way that's not threatening to the industry side, that it's going to have some sort of penalty down the road. And I think that's the question that ultimately should be explored more. And then the government can look at that data and say, okay, what do we need to do to incentivize more use? Or do we need to do more to promote the framework, right? What are the actions we can take to drive that adoption number up or down, depending upon where it resides, based upon the information? I think those are questions that ought to be explored a little bit more fully.
I think it's hard though. Like with regulators, at the end of the day, they don't believe you.
Right.
We get audited yearly. They don't believe me. I come in there, I show them what I do. They go, prove it to me, right? So I think part of it, just to sort of take a piece from you, I think part of it is NIST to me is important because it started to get the country to start talking about this at varying levels of business, whether it's a 5-person or a 5,000-person shop. I think at the end of the day, the government and the regulators need to sort of get, I think you're right, more invested in a way where they don't necessarily, it's not necessarily the fear that's selling it, but it's more that, look, this is just we're a part of this forever now. Like, cybersecurity is going to be here. These conversations aren't going away. They're not going to slow down. And I think the more of these types of sort of panel discussions and things like that are going to make it better. I think it's just going to be something where it's going to take time.
I mean, I'd like to go back, and I agree with Chris's point that it's not so much measuring the use of the framework, but measuring whether people are doing something, are utilizing tools that tie back to the framework. And I think, we've had this discussion since before the framework even, the first workshop for the framework even happened, right? There was a lot of discussion saying, well, how are we going to know if people are actually implementing the framework from day one, before the framework even existed? And I've always felt as though that sort of, there is a reason that happens, and part of it is because NIST is a measurement organization. So there is a driver at NIST to tie everything back to measurement, as they should. But the better question is the framework useful to companies and organizations? And I think clearly it has been useful, right? Is it being used? That's harder to measure right now. I think there are ways to do it, as people have said, but I'm not sure that that's really the key point. I think there's another piece of it, which is, can the framework be used as a measurement device internally, right? And I think that is a different question. Right now, it's not that great at that, and I think it can become better at that as time goes on. It is something that has been discussed a lot since the beginning of the framework. But can you use it to baseline yourself against other industries? Can you use it to baseline yourself where you are today and where you were? Right now, a lot of that is you're using other tools, profiles, or other tools in order to do that off the framework. Can some of that be built into the framework? I think that would make it more useful, which I think is more important than how much is the framework itself being used. And because even in this idea of it, so when we first built the framework, I talked to some folks from the previous administration and from the Bush administration who said to me, I don't really like the framework because it's not operational. And I tried to figure out what that meant, but I think I finally came down to the fact that it was similar to something that Pete said. You can't really just take it and say, okay, we're going to do all of this today and have the framework in your hand, right? And we're going to go down this list, and by the end of the week,
96.
we're going to be done with all 96 categories. Like, that's not what the framework's good for. It is good. Okay, we're not great at this category. How do we go about improving on it? So I think it's total. It's not true that it's not operational. It's just you're not using the entire thing, right? The entire framework in an operational capacity. You're using pieces of it in an operational capacity, and that's part of what risk management and a risk management tool is. And especially at this level, other tools can be built off of it. Is really the goal. Is that happening? Yes, that's happening. Can we measure that? That's going to be harder to measure, right? And to me, that's really the kind of the real piece of it. Is it useful? And so I think that's the fact that that's hard. That part of it's harder to measure, but we know that that's useful. It's good enough for us now. Let's figure out how to make the measurement tools within the framework for companies better and measure whether people are doing risk management in companies, and that's more important than measuring whether they're using the framework.
Tim, you want to last crack at it, or are you satisfied?
No, I thought those are
Okay.
really good perspectives.
Sounds good. Well, let me open it then. I could ask 20 more questions, but I'll open it up to the floor. And I think if you push the button, there we go. So the microphone should pick you up. We're webcasting as well, so for folks on the internet, it's better if you're speaking into the microphone.
Sure. Annette Toussaint, Deutsche Telekom. And I wanted to ask Pete. He mentioned GDPR, and he mentioned that he's anticipating the California law to have wider implications for the rest of the country too. And I just wanted to see if he could elaborate on how he's preparing for that, or how he's using those two laws in his analysis and his preparations.
Yeah, I think for us, it's interesting. A year ago, we merged with a hedge fund. So we sort of moved into, we only cared about the United States and individuals there. And we immediately jumped into Europe and realized very quickly that GDPR was as I call it internally, it's a beast. There's a lot to it. The regulation's complicated. But when you start to break down the regulation too, and you go to places like Bermuda and other places, like Bermuda has PIPA, which is one of their regulations that are down there, they're very similarly designed, where it's really focused on individual investors or individual people and sort of how they can control their data. California basically took GDPR regulations, completely mirrored them, and are saying, hey, we're going to basically do the same thing. And I think what's going to happen there is when you're a firm like mine, where we're dealing with every state in this country, you're dealing with multiple countries that are out there as well, it's one of those things where it's hard for us to differentiate one investor versus all of our other investors. So for us, it's harder to say, hey, for investor X, we're going to let you control your data, which means if you want to leave as a client, we can hand you over all the data. We can delete all the data that we have in our systems. We can show you exactly what vendors that we use and where your data is over there too. So it's really hard for us as a small business to say, give that type of control to investor A, but not give it to investor B, who's maybe not in the regulation GDPR. So for us, we sort of looked at it and said, let's take the most strict rules that are out there for one of our investors and apply it to our entire investor base. So this way, we're obviously dealing with a larger level of regulation, but at the end of the day, when you look at GDPR and GDPR-like regulations that are out there, they make sense. I mean, I always look at it as throw yourself on the other side of the table, pretend that you're an investor in one of my funds. What kind of control of the data do you want? You know, we use a lot of different third-party vendors and things like that. I would want to know, you know, okay, when I give you my bank account information, where does that information go? Who has that information, right? When I send you an email, what archiving solution does it go to? How can I pull that information back? Oh, wait, I can't pull it back because the SEC says that I have to keep it for X number of years. I want to know all that kind of stuff. So we sort of looked at it as let's not be afraid of GDPR and GDPR-like policies. Let's embrace it. Let's apply it to everybody, and let's make this something where everybody gets the benefit of this, whether we agree with the regulation or not. That's sort of how we view it.
Let me give a very specific example of how the framework can help someone that wants to prepare for GDPR and the GDPR in California, and actually the government, the defense contractor rules that have come around, new defense contractor rules that are coming around. So all of them now require, following on GDPR, 72-hour notice when there's after post-breach notice to someone. In my experience, no one is ready to give 72 hours of notice, right? I mean, we think that, oh, there's an incident, we'll just tell people. You know, in the experience of dealing with a lot of breaches, right, it's hard to learn a lot. Even if the person who finds the breach knows that they're supposed to tell people internally within 24, 48 hours, right, which is not often the case, right? Sometimes someone has found the breach and the people that know that they're supposed to notify don't even find out for 72 hours. But even if they tell, it's hard to figure out the size, scope, what exactly you're notifying about within that 72-hour period. But that's going to be the rule. And in order to get there, you're going to have to look at this at the detect, respond, recover side of the framework in a lot more detail so that you are prepared to be able to respond very, very quickly, and everyone in the organization knows what they're supposed to be doing, what their role is in an incident situation. So a lot of the framework is actually, you know, organized around that piece of it, and that's the only way you're going to get to 72 hours.
Fred Rosa with Johns Hopkins APO. On the one hand, I think that it's easy to reach and support three quick-hitting, tentative conclusions. One, the NIST framework is a valuable tool. Two, many positive developments out there in the private and public sector, much of which owes some relationship to what NIST has done and put out there. And then three, that there still remains enormous differences between and among different sectors, public and private, and many, many vulnerabilities, some of which are due to key cyber actors not being as proactive and aggressive as they should, and some of it's a dynamic landscape. That's one side of this. But here we are at the 5-year point, and I'm putting on a consumer's hat, a private citizen's hat. I'm looking for what's the public policy way forward now. Because essentially, if I think of myself in my situation as a consumer, if I want to invest funds and feel secure about it, Peter, going to some of what you've offered, if I want to choose who's going to provide my electrical power up in New Hampshire, I've got different choices up there. If I want to decide which hospital I'm going into for major open heart surgery, right now, and in many other examples, it's up to me, essentially, to do somehow some type of assessment with respect to the cyber capabilities, the cybersecurity of service providers. And I would offer from a public policy position, that's not positive. That's not a wise course forward. So having offered that.
Yeah, so I would say we are seeing the so we've seen I mean, I should say, first of all, the first part of yours, that was like made me feel as though this is one of the more positive cybersecurity panels that you will hear, right? Most of them are totally negative, more on the second side of what you had to say. So it's it's actually felt pretty good to be on a positive, forward-looking panel in this space. But I think in addressing those concerns, you need to look at the progress we've made on the regulatory side. So first of all, on government agencies now required to use the framework. They're looking at risk management, and this is in a risk management way. Supposedly, we're holding leadership accountable for their actions in this space. We haven't seen the administration take an action based on it, but they have an executive order that says they're going to be doing that. We have seen the financial sector now, as of this week, with the new profile. They said directly. So this is the financial services. Well, now formal financial services roundtable. Now the Banking Policy Institute and the ABA, the American Bankers Association, have said we are a regulated industry. This is how we want to be regulated. Where that's not changing that we are regulated. What we don't want to do is we don't want to have 6 audits of using different language from different folks. We want to all use the NIST framework to do that, and we want to be able to then discuss that with our shareholders, discuss that, I mean, for large public institutions, and have make this a priority for everyone involved in this space. I think that's a enormous progress. Now it's taken, as you said, almost 4.5 years to get to this point from there, but we are there with them as well. I think on the hospital side, you do have, so you required an act of Congress, but they created a profile for the healthcare industry that HHS put together. They're going to be speaking at the NIST risk management. People that put it together are going to be speaking at the NIST risk management conference as well. Still voluntary, but we start to see HHS guidance leaning on it a lot more. So for medical devices, there's all the languages around the NIST framework. So this gets us to the point where we're starting to use the same language in all these different sectors. I think that eventually leads to better consumer controls. Even then, having what I think I was concerned about before the NIST framework existed, which was these rating companies coming in rating security, in which case you have different rating systems, right, that mean different things to different people, or the rating system measures something that was important 4 years ago and not something that's important today, right? I think moving more towards risk management, using the same language, gets us to a better place for consumers. Even then, some of the scoring systems that would be more confusing to consumers.
Just to pick up on Ari's point, so I think the way we're organized around critical infrastructure is for each sector, there's a sector-specific agency, and then there's a regulatory agency, right? So for communications, just as an example, our regulatory agency is obviously the FCC, the sector-specific agency is DHS, and each sector has their own structure, right? So as you mentioned, if you're healthcare, it's Health and Human Services, right? So the sector regulators have to look at and see what's appropriate for their individual sectors, depending upon what aspect of the economy. The other area that I think is that we've seen that Ari didn't mention was the Federal Trade Commission. So the Federal Trade Commission has taken the step of mapping. They currently have a reasonableness standard for security. It basically says that there's a reasonable expectation that you should have some level of security in services, and they've basically mapped that reasonableness standard to things like the Graham GLBA, so the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, and also to the NIST framework. And so by doing that, they've effectively established that if you are not using at least some of those tools in some respects, that you may not be acting reasonably, in which case you could be opening yourselves up to some sort of enforcement action from the FTC. So I don't think it's correct to say that just because the framework is a voluntary process, that it means there is no regulation in the space. There is actual regulation through entities like the FTC and each of the individual sector agencies that Ari mentioned. They'll have to look at it and see what's appropriate for their sector based upon what their authorities are in jurisdiction. But I do think those conversations are actively happening. That said, I mean, we generally take the position that because cyber is such a dynamic and moving space, that we still strongly believe in the public-private partnership model for security, and that the government agencies should be working jointly with industry to deal with these issues, because it doesn't lend itself well to things like static checklists and for cyber. And I think when you look at the framework, one of the reasons why it's been widely adopted by industry is because it's not a static checklist. It's a process-oriented framework. You can apply that to a checklist like SANS or what have you if you want to do that, but it doesn't just say, here's the things you must go do and you're good, because if we did that, then a year later we'll find out we've got a whole new attack, and whatever we thought was good a year ago is not going to be good now.
Yeah, I guess this is a question for Amy. The president recently signed in August the Small Business Cybersecurity Act. I know the director of NIST has about a year to come up with solutions on how to tie in and help small business. I guess the question is, give us a status on how does the framework and the process to actually provide those requirements for little businesses coming along. But more important is that you also engage your small business in the process as to get a resolution on what's going to come out in the next year.
Thank you for that. We do already have some resources that we've been trying to promote on our framework website. We do try to continue having dialogues and engage with small businesses, because we do recognize that there are some unique challenges that they have, and some of the things that we've listed in the framework might be hard to implement if you're small or don't have the number of resources, can't have dedicated IT staff. So we try to put out different types of guidance and suggestions, some types of starter kits and such that you can find on the website. There's also a NIST interagency report. Sorry, I'm forgetting the number for it, but it actually is a set of guidelines that are characterized around the 5 functions of the framework that are sort of lists of suggested ways that small businesses can implement some of the outcomes and subcategories in the framework. And over the next year, we're going to continue to develop more of these as the legislation requires. We'll also promote and amplify other things that have come out. DC had just recently released some cybersecurity resources for small businesses, and continue meeting with and trying to hear what are the different needs and what are some types of things that people would like to see incorporated into our guidance moving forward. So yes, we'll definitely make sure they're involved in the process. We have a Computer Security Source Center site that also lists a lot of this work that NIST is doing, some of it in partnership with the Small Business Administration, FBI. So a lot of things are currently out there, but over the next year, we'll definitely be developing more. Thank you.
I just want to say, I mean, I think that there's been a push to try to encourage small businesses to utilize managed security services and cloud services more, and I think that's a great idea. I think it's going to be very difficult in the future, and only getting more. I mean, it's already very difficult, and it's only going to be more difficult in the future for small businesses to manage their own security, unless they want to have a security staff that's relatively large. I mean, it's hard for 1 or 2 people to manage all the security for even small businesses at this point. And having the knowledge that someone is looking out for you in a broader context, or that you're part of a group in the cloud context, I think is very a valuable thing to have on your side as a small business.
And I just want to throw out there as well, because I found it incredibly useful. There's the IR for small businesses that NIST put out 2 years ago this fall, that interpretive informational resource. Resource. I can never remember what IR stands for, and I'm not going to come up with the number 7623. But it's the small business implement. It's the initial document for small business implementation for the framework. And as someone who, in the field, thinking about it, having read the framework 4 or 5 times, used it as a cure for insomnia, like I was a little bit like, this is a great document, but what do you do with it? And the IR is very specific. It says, like, go through, map your information assets. Here's one spreadsheet. Map your network assets. Map your users. Put these together and figure out how they communicate with each other. And just as, like, literally the first step when you pick up the framework, I thought that document was incredible. I don't hear it talked about as much as I'd like, so I'm putting my endorsement on it.
I want to disagree with something, which is I think that the intro to the framework is actually very well written and actually very readable. It's just when you get to the core of the document, the appendices, that it's sleep-inducing, in my opinion.
See, I felt a little bit the other direction, which was that, like, people were going to read the narrative and think, I don't know what any of this means. oh, but here's a spreadsheet, and I can go ahead and just implement the spreadsheet. And then you get this phenomenon where people are like, well, I'll just do the 96 subcategories, right? And really
I've had
that's not what
board
that's not what it's
members.
for.
I've had board members that don't know cybersecurity that well tell me that do risk management that the intro to the framework was very helpful for
Is-
them
right.
in understanding how cybersecurity can be done
in a risk
in
management, in an
and
ERM, in an ERM
process. Yeah.
right.
So as part of the risk management review, Senator Daines, for example, has introduced a Cyber Safety Act bill. And there was a provision in the CISA bill last year that gave liability protection on information sharing on threat indicators. Since the Safety Act is also a voluntary program and would be as applied in the cyber world, the belief is that the framework could be used as a foundation for filing an application. Ari, you've been up to your eyes in the issue. Is liability limitation an incentive for corporate boards and general counsels?
The problem is, again, like, this goes back to this point about like that the framework's a big thing and there's a lot tied to it. So you can't really, even this says you can't implement the NIST framework, right? It's not, and that's what you would really need to give that kind of assurance. I mean, we can get Rand Beer's opinion on this, who probably knows more about the Safety Act than most people do. But my view is, unless you can say, we've implemented it, and here's third-party assurance that we've implemented it, it's probably not a great idea to give Safety Act kind of coverage for it. On the other hand, I think we could come up with tools based on the framework in which we could come up with that kind of assurance around it, and that might be a way to go about dealing with it. So I'm not saying it's out of the question to say that you shouldn't get Safety Act coverage and it shouldn't be somehow tied to the framework. I just think if you have a broad legislative statement saying, oh, if you implement in this framework, you get Safety Act liability coverage, I think that would be concerning to me.
Yeah, I'm not sure how that relates. My understanding of the Safety Act is, generally speaking, that if you develop a product, service, or a process, you can go to the Safety Act office and have it effectively, granted whatever the liability protection is under the Safety Act. And whether or not that applies to something like the framework that's really about risk management processes for an entire firm versus a specific product or service, I don't know how those two things interrelate. So to Ari's point, I'm not sure that they're a perfect fit. I think the idea of safe harbor is certainly appealing to a lot of entities. So if I understand, so kind of going back to the FTC analogy, that if I'm a general counsel, and I'm not a lawyer, but if I'm working in that side of our business, if I understand that if I do the following things, I'm at least going to be considered to be acting in a reasonable way, and that effectively would give me a legal argument or a safe harbor from some sort of future litigation or that type of thing. I think that's certainly an incentive for companies, and we've talked about that quite a bit. But how that ties into the Safety Act, I'm not totally sure.
I think people should look at it that way anyways, even without the specific piece. I remember, and this is 5 years ago, but I think it's still the case. The FTC folks in the consumer protection side said to me, it used to be we would bring these cases against people that had breaches, and we would go in there and they weren't spending a dime on security. Now we go in, and again, 5 years ago, they're spending $2 million. They're just spending it on totally the wrong stuff. Right? But we have to prove that they're spending it on the wrong stuff. And if you go through a risk management effort, right, then you can demonstrate that you're prioritizing. It makes it even that much harder for the FTC and others to be able to bring a successful suit.
Additional questions? Bit of time left. So I'll take the moderator's prerogative and I'll ask about, nobody's going to like me for asking this question, but about measurements of cost effectiveness and the question of incentives, which of course was in the original executive order text and has been something that's batted around a lot in the community, but sort of seems like that we've pushed it off a little bit. We've essentially said, like, let's get our ducks in a row on framework and figure out how we're doing risk management, and then we can eventually move into a position where we're talking about incentives. But can I throw it out to the panel, like thoughts on cost effectiveness or on incentives.
So Chris is CEO at the launch of this, and I wish there was a recording of it, and I can't find the recording. I don't know where it is. I wish someone had it, because I would play it at this point of view. But Chris's CEO said, in the answer to this question, at the rollout for the framework, we have all the incentive we need to implement this, and that is fear. Right? So
That was like his mic drop moment, right? I mean,
yeah, it
everybody
was. I
like-
mean, people were like, and they used it on NPR, and I was like, it got out there. I still think that is true, that the biggest incentive is the fear side. I mean, you do have the negative incentive side, as I was saying before. You are seeing regulators pick it up. It is, and as I just said on the FTC side, it is a good proactive defense on that side as well. So there is incentive on the negative side. On the positive side, we have seen insurance companies say, if you use the framework, it's gonna, we can tie it to reducing your coverage, the cost for coverage, et cetera. We have seen a lot of companies now say to their vendors that they must utilize the framework in some ways, the same way that they do with ISO. And sometimes it's very specific, and sometimes it's more general of how they go about doing it. But it does seem to be more common today to have that in there. And I, as a law firm, I'll tell you, we are getting more requests that say you should utilize the framework in your and show that you're utilizing the framework as a vendor of ours. So I think that is more common. So I will both say I still think the biggest one is fear, and that the framework is the piece that ties it together for a lot of people and the way to do risk management in this space. However, there are these other things that are going on, that have gone on, that have gotten to a lot of the detail of the incentives that were mentioned in the original reports I wrote. That's Commerce's report. There was a Commerce report, a DHS report, and a Treasury report that were written on incentives out of the framework, and we did the Commerce one, and the things I mentioned hit on 3 of the 10 biggest categories, I would say, of incentives in there. So already.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a company like mine, there's a lot of reasons why you'd want to invest in security, right? I mean, there's a lot of business drivers. So whether it's fear, whether it's your brand. I mean, our brand is actually one of our most valuable properties, so we're only as good as our name. So not being hit with one of these types of attacks, and we've seen what's happened to other companies, big corporations. So I think a lot of big companies are in a similar position in that we have to protect our assets, which includes our brand, our reputation. We have a lot of customers who expect us to be using security. I mean, I've always said that one of the main reasons why companies get certified is because they have customers asking for it. So if you look at an AT&T, we have customers in the financial services industry and a lot of the regulated utility industry. They expect us, if we're going to do business with them, to meet certain thresholds. That's the reason we're ISO certified for certain parts of the network. That's the reason why we're PCI certified, because our clients expect that. We hold HIPAA certifications because we have customers of ours in the health and human services industry. So so there's a lot of business drivers around that. So when the framework was first launched and DHS was putting together kind of their incentives program, I've never felt comfortable speaking about incentives because a company of our size has plenty of business drivers outside of government incentives to invest in security. We're not asking for government assistance in that area. I do think, though, and if I take my AT&T hat off and I think about work I've done inside the industry, not everybody is an AT&T, right? Not everybody has the same level of resources and the same drivers, and so there are going to be, like if you talk to small and mid-sized carriers that are out there, they have a different set of economic factors they're considering, and in some cases they have spoken about the need for help in that regard, and there has been discussions with DHS and other parts of government about the proper economic incentives for them to invest in security. So I think there's a different conversation. I don't want to say that small and mid-sized, my brethren in that part of the industry, don't invest in these things. I just think the conversation is a different conversation if you're talking about someone who is, who is a much smaller business than an entity like mine that's a $200 billion plus enterprise.
Yeah, for us, back in the day, we looked at it as regulation was pushing us into a direction that we had to do something. But I think as time went on, we learned that for us, we don't need an incentive. I mean, at the end of the day, we're trying to deal with a lot of different individual clients and institutions. So for us, we removed the term incentive and replaced it with care. Do we care about the people that we are serving? And if we do, then we should want to bring them the best security program we can. Nothing's perfect. I don't care what framework you use. I don't care how many CISOs you have on staff. It doesn't matter. Yeah. Problems exist. But I'd rather make sure that we're doing everything we possibly can so that in case something does happen, we can sit there and say, hey, look, something happened, but we literally did everything we possibly could. We had the right technology, the right people, the right program. We had the right policies. Things miss. So for us, it wasn't an incentive. Again, I changed that term to we care, and at that point, if you can get your organization caring about it, you shouldn't necessarily care about. I'm not saying don't spend money. It's just, again, it's a care thing.
It's a really good point, and I think a point everybody should know is that no matter what your security program is, there's no guarantee you're not going to get hit with a cyber incident. There seems to be a lot of people who assume that every time somebody is hit with one of these attacks, that they were, in some respects, not doing enough or not investing. That's not necessarily true. I mean, we're dealing with attackers like other nation states who have they're spending billions of dollars on their ability to hack into these systems, and it's a lot easier to be on the offensive side than the defensive side because it's not like they're telling you the playbook. They're not announcing. It's like a football team doesn't tell you before the play, hey, we're going to throw the ball to the receiver over here on the right. Let's go put your resources over there to defend against it. So it's a lot harder to be on the defensive side of cyber. And so no matter what we do, people are going to get hit. So I think one takeaway should be that companies have a huge incentive. Companies like mine have a big incentive, but there's no guarantees.
So all great points, but also this building off of, since my focus has been on some international work since joining NIST, often when we meet or discuss things with other international organizations and countries, we would ask, why have you gravitated to, or why are you looking at the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, since there are so many available out there? What would draw people towards looking at or considering this one? We do hear a lot of some of the benefits Chris was mentioning earlier, with it being risk-based, outcome-driven, flexible, cost-effective. So we've heard a lot of countries say that it's been very useful also because of the approach to which it was put together, having input from industry, which gives it less of the feel of government coming at them regulation, but something that's built off of input as well from industry and academia. And also just heard that it's been very useful as a communication tool because it offers the common language by function. So it's made it a little bit easier for things like reporting out requirements or explaining what their organization is doing or where they're trying to go with their target state. So a lot of things that we try to mention as positive attributes of the framework, and which are still incorporated in version 1.1, are some of the things that we hear from others about why they would choose to look at that when there are definitely a lot of other options out there.
So, any additional questions from the floor? I'll probably just give you guys back 5 minutes rather than pushing with more obnoxious questions from my perspective. But I want to thank each of the panelists for coming out and for discussing this today. I think it's been incredibly important. It's an incredibly important topic, right? Like how do we address how do we move to a cyber risk management perspective? We've obviously been, I think we've heard here, there's been a lot of progress in the last 5 years in moving that direction, moving away from just a checklist with no context, or moving from just an incident response approach. Let me just thank again the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security as our host, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for the funding for this research project, and thank all of you for coming, and to those on the web as well. Yeah. Nice to meet you.